We live in interesting times when it comes to climate change, environmental journalism, and campaigning, not least because of climategate. I think it's fair to say it has been a defining moment for quite a lot of us, whether we are campaigners or journalists. Equally, the big build-up to Copenhagen, and then what everybody largely agrees was the failure at Copenhagen to meet those ambitions and those hopes that there were for that, has left us in an interesting position when it comes to climate change, and one I think we want to address tonight. But at the same time, we also have a new UK government, which, on first glance at least, appears to be potentially one of the greenest governments that we could have, regardless of what you might think about their politics, left or right. So there's some interesting areas of discussion. I'm joined this evening by three people now, since Mark can't make it, but Kelly Rigg is the Executive Director of the Global Campaign for Climate Change. Richard Black is one of the environment correspondents for the BBC, and James Radisson is the editor of the Environment Guardian web pages. That's right, I think, yeah. I'll ask each one of them to tell you a little bit about what they do and where they stand on these sort of things very briefly, and also, because we do stand at this pivotal time, to say very briefly whether they think there is actually any point in being an environmental journalist or a campaigner in 2010. Kelly.
Well, to answer your question, first off, I guess it's not going to come as a surprise that I will say yes, there is a point. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Campaign for Climate Action, which is an alliance of around 230 organizations and social movements, which came together in the run-up to Copenhagen under the agreed ask, a common ask of calling for a fair, ambitious, and legally binding treaty in Copenhagen. We had approximately 15 million people sign up to that pledge. We managed to get 100,000 people out on the street in Copenhagen, marching for a good deal in Copenhagen. We got global days of action in September and October and December, which brought out unprecedented numbers of people standing up to be counted. So I think that the closing message for our campaign, and something that all of our partner organizations, not all, but many of them flashed onto their website at the very end of Copenhagen, was we're not done yet. They're not done yet, and neither are we. And so I think that it's very clear that there's a strong appetite to continue, that Copenhagen was a bit of a disaster from the perspective of people like us who are watching these sorts of discussions and negotiations, but for the vast majority of the public, it didn't even figure on the radar. And yeah, I would just like to say that there are opinion polls, despite the suggestions to the contrary by some of the media, opinion polls still show that there's very, very strong belief still in the phenomenon of global warming. And I think that that's a very hopeful sign, because the fact that those people are not jaded by Copenhagen means there's a lot of opportunity to continue to engage them in a different way this year.
Thanks, Kelly. Richard.
Sure, so I'm Richard Black, one of the BBC's environment correspondents. Julian would probably say one of the BBC's many environment correspondents. I work primarily for the website. My background's in international reporting. I worked for World Service Radio for many years. I must do the boring corporate bit first. As an impartial, unbiased BBC person, I'm not allowed to think that it's a good thing that climate change is happening or not happening. I'm not allowed to think that it's a good thing that it might be sorted out, or that it might be sorted out. On the one hand, it might be a good thing to save the world. On the other hand, it might not be. So the perspective from which I'm talking to you is not one in which I'm allowed to be personally engaged, at least not until 8:30. So in terms of, is it worth being an environment journalist? Absolutely, absolutely, for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, the kind of most fundamental job of a journalist really is to document and report, and that's still going on. And in fact, part of our job, I see what you guys think of this, part of our job very much so is to follow through Copenhagen, is to follow through ClimateGate, is to follow through the IPCC reviews, because these stories are not ended. The one chapter may have ended, but the processes go on, and it's part of our job to follow all that through. A second reason is that there are many other environmental issues as well as climate change, and some people in the conservation movement argue that in fact as journalists we neglected those last year, and now we have an opportunity to get into those issues again. Some of them also interact with climate change. And in some ways, although the beginning of the year felt slightly rudderless to me, in another way, it's shaping up to be perhaps a richer year, because we can get back to the sort of broad agenda that we saw at Stockholm in '72, that we saw at Rio in '92, that we had to kind of narrow down so much on last year. So although there are many days when I kind of, struggle out of the hard-working, underfunded BBC office at 9 p.m. and wonder whether it's worth doing the job, when I think about it logically, yeah, it definitely is.
And you, James?
I'm the second in command in the environment section at the Guardian. I edit the website. I used to be the science correspondent at the Guardian. And also, with particular relevance to this, I was one of the editors who handled the Fred Pearce investigation that we did into the climate emails. I don't particularly like the term climategate, actually, but anyway, into the climate emails, and which I think we put about 14,000 words online, 14,000 words into the paper, about double that online, which we invited comments for, and that's going to be coming out as a book in June, called The Climate Files, which I'm contractually obliged to mention. Is it worth being an environment journalist? Well, yes, certainly. I mean, I agree actually that I would sort of say the combination of Copenhagen and the UEA emails and the IPCC stories that happened at the beginning of the year, the glacier mistake, all of that together, I think, has been a sort of massive turning point, probably for all of us, and a sort of defining moment, as you say, in our careers. But I do think that it's kind of easy to get into a bubble and think that everyone is feeling the same way, and I'm not sure that's the case. I mean, I just don't think all of these stories have had the impact that we may think they have, and it's true that polling evidence suggests that people are less convinced by climate change than they were, say, in October. But part of that is, I think, due to a very harsh winter on the east coast of America and in Britain. And I just wanted to bring up one specific bit of polling that I find particularly puzzling, but is quite instructive, I think. This is a BBC Populous poll that came out in February, and the number of people who think climate change is, quote, definitely happening had fallen from 44% in November to 31%. But when you sort of drill down into that and say, are you aware of all these stories about mistakes by the IPCC and scientists writing emails, etc., 57% say yes. Of those, 73% said it made no difference. 11 said that these controversies made them less concerned about the risks posed by climate change. And 16% said that the reports made them more concerned about the risks of climate change. So, strangely, ClimateGate, or whatever you want to call it, has made people more concerned about climate change or less, according to that. Now, I can't really explain that, but I think the sort of simple story that all of these things have contributed to people not accepting climate change is not quite true.
James, thank you. I mean, the Guardian, I think, stood out because of Fred's work on the climate emails. But as a principle, and without wanting to get too deep into an inquest into the whole thing as far as journalism was concerned, I think it's fair we need to have a quick look at it. Did we as journalists, the whole environmental journalism profession, get it wrong on the climate emails? Did we ignore it for too long? I certainly felt that we were aware of it, but it seemed like just the same old from a bunch of nutters, and therefore could conveniently be ignored. Did we get that very, very wrong?
I think we did, actually, and I'm not speaking really for anyone else, but just in terms of the Guardian's coverage. I mean, the trouble was the timing. I mean, the timing of it was obviously connected with Copenhagen. I don't think it had really any appreciable effect on Copenhagen. But what it meant was all of the environmental resources of our reporting were pointing at Copenhagen by that stage. And we had sort of 8 people going to Copenhagen, which I think is about 1/100th of the number the BBC said. And we had a lot of kind of balls ready to roll, and this was kind of a distraction that was quite difficult to deal with, and we didn't really appreciate the significance of it. And also, we didn't have a lot to work with because frankly, the PR operation around it was absolutely dire, just terrible from the University of East Anglia. They offered nothing to people who were kind of sympathetic to their arguments, if you like, and wanted to give the scientist side of the story. There was literally nothing in terms of the scientist side of the story to work with. And so, and also when the story first broke on the Friday, the lawyers were saying to us, you can't quote any of these emails because they will not confirm or deny whether any particular phrases are from the emails or not. So we'd potentially be libeling people. I mean, within a few days, it became clear that wasn't going to be an issue, and so we started quoting from the emails. But that's why we sort of had a bit of a stock take at the end of Copenhagen, and we said, look, we really haven't delved into this in enough detail, and that's why we put a journalist, very experienced environmental journalist in Fred Pearce, on the case for 5 or 6 weeks, and put together, I think, the most detailed investigation into what is in the emails. And without getting into lots and lots of detail about, as you say, a kind of inquest, I mean, I think you can only really come out the other side of that and say that the science is solid if you've done that. And people were sort of saying that within 2 days of the emails coming out, and I don't think we really could.
Was there recognition within the BBC, Richard, that this was a big story? I can remember on that Friday talking to UEA and them saying, no, look, I'm sorry, we're going home now, we'll have to deal with this on Monday, which didn't help anybody very much, and to a degree it left them with a huge amount of egg over their face as a result, because they didn't respond quickly enough. But within the BBC, was the importance of the story recognised early enough or not?
Well, I think there was an effort to sort out in political terms whether it would be important for Copenhagen. And I remember talking to a few ambassadors who would be representing their countries at Copenhagen and asking that very question. And only one, the Saudi ambassador, came back and said, yes, it would be. So we wrote a story to that effect. I completely concur with James's point, actually. All our resources were already over-committed to Copenhagen. I mean, not only were we trying to follow the daily, the hourly kind of political turns and who was saying what in what capital and try and make sense of this, but we're also committed to doing lots of background articles. And of course, we were hopelessly behind schedule in the way that journalists usually haphazardly are. And in retrospect, yes, we probably should have taken someone off Copenhagen and said, read all the emails and read all the files and don't come out until you've done it. But it didn't happen. I think you can look even further back in hindsight and say, should we have delegated someone to go through the IPCC report at the end of 2007 with a fine-tooth comb? And clearly we should have done. But I put this to my editor, and she said, well, we wouldn't have let you do it because it would have been 2 weeks of unproductive work. We're not a heavily financed institution like The Guardian that can afford to pay someone to do that. In hindsight, it's a wonderful thing, isn't it?
Kelly, did the environmental campaigning movement get caught out by it as well? I mean, again, you, I guess, like us as journalists, were full on thinking about Copenhagen, and suddenly this came out of left field.
Well, absolutely. I mean, to some extent, it didn't come out of left field because it's part of a 20-year campaign by the denial industry. I mean, not that they necessarily launched this one, but they certainly jumped on the opportunity. And it's a very well-documented campaign, and it hinges on, the whole strategy of that campaign hinges on the notion of uncertainty, right? Because the public doesn't understand that uncertainty is part of the nature of science. So basically, their narrative goes something along the lines is that any uncertainty in the science means that there's uncertainty as to whether there is actually a problem or not. And if that uncertainty exists about the problem, then there's an uncertainty as to whether you need to bother to solve the problem, and therefore you argue that it's unnecessary, premature, costly, et cetera. And that's how that debate has been going for 20 years, and that's certainly what came out in this one as well. And I think that for the environmental community, there's differing opinions about how you deal with that. A lot of people say we should just ignore it because it's ridiculous, it's the wrong narrative, and every time you get into that debate, you perpetuate that, and we need to move beyond that. The fact is, the science is largely settled, regardless of what this, what these emails said. It has not made a dent in the science. Secondly, there's all of the impacts that we can see with our own eyes that don't depend on, models and whatever. I mean, it's clear that it's happening. There's other parts of the community which feel that you need to, so much of the campaign has been founded on the science says this, the science says we must do that, and therefore we need to defend the science, and we need to make sure that that's not whittled away. And I think for a lot of people there was a bit of a dilemma about what to do, but everyone concluded that, you know, it's not something that the environmental community or the NGO community more generally can defend. It's something the scientists have to defend themselves because it's really an issue of the science. In this
Pity
case.
Mark's not here tonight. But I mean, James quoted the opinion polls there. Has the whole thing done damage to both the environmental movement as a whole and to environmental journalism, do you think?
Actually, not at all. I mean, you quoted the BBC poll, but there's also an American study Stanford University did that says basically the same thing, something like that there's a dip in people who believe in global warming. And by the way, this whole notion of people believing in global warming I find totally bizarre. You know, this Senator Daniel,
religion, is it?
Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the U.S., he argued at one point everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. And I think the whole notion of, you know, this believing in global warming is a bit silly. But anyway, they did this opinion research at Stanford and concluded at the same thing, that something like 53% of people who had heard about the email scandal said it didn't change their view. And of the ones that it did change their view, it was roughly split between the ones that made them more concerned and the ones that made them less concerned. And the fact is that the dip in this overall belief in global warming only went from like 80% to 75%. When you consider in the US that about 40% of the population believes in evolution, 75% of the population believing in global warming is a really substantial and a large number. And we should actually take heart in that. The fact that this controversy has happened and it hasn't dented it that much is actually a very positive sign.
But for the two journalists here, has it changed the way your editors want you to do your environmental journalism? Richard?
I'm very lucky actually in the particular role I have with the website, and I have rather a free hand compared to a lot of colleagues, other colleagues inside the BBC and colleagues outside the BBC. But what is definitely true is that there were some program editors who have been very skeptical of the whole thing all along. I think that's largely because skepticism and being an editor kind of go hand in hand. Skepticism about everything. And most editors have come up through political journalism, in which case everyone has an angle, everyone's trying to on the make. So when the IPCC says, you know, there's this climate change, more than 90% likely, well, why are they saying that? That's the first reaction. What have they got to gain? Because that's the instinct of the sort of program editor kind of thing. And there's no doubt that some of them viewed us, the correspondents, as having sort of gone native in a way. And we were almost getting blamed in some quarters for the failure of Copenhagen. You know, you told us it was going to be this and that. Well, whatever, you know. We're not players. We just report this stuff. So to that extent, it definitely has made a difference. I wonder whether it will all become circular, though. I mean, I liked the point about the weather, the cold weather. I think that's absolutely correct. And I do wonder if if we have a blistering summer, for example, whether editors are going to be saying, it probably was something in that climate change stuff after all. You know?
Yeah. I mean, from the Guardian's point of view, I mean, do you think that we have all, as Richard was saying, as environmental journalists, become a little bit too cozy, a little bit too close to it, and this has been something of a wake-up call?
I certainly think there is, there's always that tension, I think, in any specialism that you have, whether it's science or environment, you know. To a certain extent, you have to gain the trust of people within your specialism, and you know, because that's how you get stories out of them, and that's how you do your job, basically. If you're permanently on the outside, then you don't get very interesting stories. But at the same time, if you're too on the inside, then you stop asking the critical questions. I mean, we've been sort of generally blessed at the Guardian with having an editor who is sort of the godfather of the whole environment project, who is very powerful within the organisation and is the deputy editor, and therefore, and his sort of views on the fact that the environment is a very important topic for us haven't changed because of anything really that's happened in the last sort of 6 months, and so you know the fact that we've got 6 correspondents who can report on this. More than any other newspaper in the world, I think, means that we can keep on going. But I think that it is appropriate to do a bit of soul searching and saying, you know, well, you know, there were well, certainly one very serious error in the IPCC report that nobody picked up on, and a couple of less serious errors, but nonetheless errors in what was supposed to be the kind of the ultimate uber gold standard peer-reviewed document in the world. You know, that is what a critical environmental journalist corps should be finding. And with, I mean, with the sort of climate email stuff, I mean, there are definitely issues there which I think the scientific community needs to address and really take from that, rather than kind of putting up a barrier and saying, you know, this is all a load of nonsense. You know, arguably, we should have been into them a bit earlier too.
Given that the one of the inquiries into the climate emails, the allegedly independent scientific inquiry, it was actually fairly independent scientific inquiry done fairly quickly, did actually conclude, when we talked to the people involved, that in all the discussion about all of this, the statistician on it from Bristol, whose name I can't remember, Bob will probably remind me, but was to a degree slightly critical of the way they'd handled their statistics. There was a recognition that the concerns expressed about the famous man hockey stick were to a degree valid, that the hockey stick calculations that Mann and so on had done did have some errors in them, and that in fact the effect was slightly less than they'd originally said in their original articles. There was a genuine scientific debate to be had there. Should we be giving space to these climate deniers, skeptics, whatever you want to call them, because sometimes they can actually be right?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, genuine skepticism is a good thing. It improves the science, but that needs to be done amongst people who actually understand what they're talking about. You know, doing that for the public is kind of pointless because they don't understand, as I said before, what the uncertainties actually mean. And I think that the place for that kind of debate has to be in the scientific journals, the peer-reviewed journals, et cetera, and not necessarily in the public press. It's not helpful.
Yeah, I think the issue of how the media covers skepticism or denialism, something we were just having a chat about downstairs before we came up here, because it's something that we've all had to live with, I think, for the last sort of 5 or 10 years. And my own approach has been, I suppose, nothing formal, but you know, if someone has expertise in a particular subject and it's kind of relevant, then I'm happy to talk to them. So, for example, if we're talking about climate science, I wouldn't be happy to take Lord Lawson's view on something. But if we're talking about the politics of climate change and how it plays out in the UK and particularly in the Conservative Party, I would be happy, because to me he has an informed position on that, but not so informed on the science. But I think what ClimateGate and the Himalayas issue has really thrown into very, very stark relief is two issues within the way that science works. First of all, clearly a lot of the scientists that were wrapped up in this were expecting that they would simply do science for the rest of their lives, and that's all they do, and they'd publish stuff in journals and go to conferences, and that was as far as it went. Well, as scientists in many other fields have found out down the years, it doesn't always work like that. And if your field of science becomes controversial for whatever reason, you have to have somewhere in that skill set you have to have a completely different skill set, whether you have it personally, whether people around you help you with it, whatever it is. You cannot survive in that ivory tower once the sort of spotlight is on you. The other thing, and this is perhaps something that applies particularly to UEA, is that science traditionally, rather informally, sort of allocates responsibility to different people. So if you are a researcher and you say to your prof, I think we ought to be looking at X, and the prof is quite likely to say, oh, well, so-and-so at that university, he does X, so don't bother with that, we'll leave them to it. There's a kind of trusting, which you can see is actually in many ways is a very nice way to live, and in some ways it's a very good way to live, because what it avoids is endless duplication of the same kind of scientific questions. But I think the question is now raised whether in something that is so important, whether that's adequate anymore, whether this slightly old school, perhaps slightly amateurish way of allocating responsibilities actually works, and whether you do need to have more sort of replication, whether you need to set that into the scientific system a little bit more.
How difficult was it to report the story, given that complicated nature of it, that issues around uncertainty? Did it pose any particular challenges?
Which the emails in particular?
Yeah.
As in whose point of view do we
Well,
trust?
and it's how do you write it? How do you explain it? How do you get it across in a relatively small space? The complex ideas that are involved.
I think, from a journalistic point of view, what the emails did provide were lots of very, very colourful quotes, which made it, in some ways, quite easy to write. But that's why, in a way, in some quarters, it was reported very, very badly, because it was just some of those quotes were kind of presented out of context and without the explanation around what some of the issues were. And it was an immensely complex, both scientifically and in terms of the interrelations between the different sort of protagonists that are involved in the emails, and the sort of background in terms of who was peer reviewing whom and things like that. But I think the only way to really understand what the emails mean was to get into them and spend a month reading them and then writing many thousands of words about them. It was genuinely a story that was very, very difficult to sort of sum up, particularly at the beginning, where you simply didn't have one side of the story.
Actually, one other thing I'd like to throw in, I meant to mention earlier. One of the things as a journalist that you're very wary of all the time is people trying to sell you a pup. And you've got to be wary not to be led, so you don't follow someone else's agenda, you always do your own job. And in a sense, this was something that someone somewhere wanted us to report. And they wanted us to report it as a scientific story. In one sense, it was a political story masquerading as a scientific story. And that, I think, made life very difficult. There were very difficult decisions to be made. I can't really think of another incident like that while I've been doing the job that's created such sort of deep and important decisions that had to be taken so quickly under quite great pressure, actually.
Let's move on a little bit to the slightly bigger picture, because the climate emails coincided, we suspect probably deliberately, don't we, with the big Copenhagen conference at the end of last year, which was billed, I think, by all of us as journalists, and I think probably by campaigners as well, as being the planet's last great hope. It was our last chance to do something, to get it right, to put us on the right course to a sustainable future. And it didn't work. It didn't happen. It failed in whichever degree from whichever point of view you have, to a greater extent or not. Were we wrong to put so much hope into it in the first place, Ellie?
No,
to build it up in the way that we did.
Well, it's an interesting question. First off, I think it was an enormous opportunity, and we really did have a chance to put things on the right track, and it was just, a really big, failed, lost chance that's going to be hard to get back again. Whether it was right to put so much emphasis on it, I think it was. I think it did inspire a lot of people. Certainly it grew the movement. The climate movement was never as big as it was by the end of the year. People really came together and felt like they were empowered to do something. I think the failure was the part of just a political will. I mean, there was no other reason for the failure than that political will being lacking. And I think the lesson for that is that, it's probably a mistake to think that we can campaign at the UNFCCC, at the meetings themselves. We need to go back and we need to change the dynamic on the ground in key countries to bolster that political will. So, for example, here in the UK, the 1010 campaign, which Lizzie might say something about at some point if asked, is an excellent example of how to create a sense of something happening that's not dependent on the politics at the UNFCCC. And I think that's where we need to go now, is to really engage the public in a different way, to talk to the public from where they are now, not where we want them to be or where we think they should be concerned, because we're just not reaching them enough that way. We reached a lot of people that way. I think we made the movement come alive in some respects, but now we need to make that felt by everyone.
I think the reason why journalists and campaigners put so much emphasis on Copenhagen really was because governments had said in Bali that this is what they wanted to do, that by the Copenhagen summit they wanted to have something that meant full and sustained implementation of the climate convention. So I don't think it was kind of unreasonable for anyone to expect them to at least attempt to follow through on this. I mean, it seems quite reasonable, really. So that's fine. did we, I think in retrospect, as journalists, and I include everyone in this, we collectively got it wrong on two fronts. First of all, as environment journalists, climate journalists, I suppose we were for a large chunks of the time, we tend to speak mainly to, when we speak to politicians, to environment ministers, and environment departments and climate departments, not to prime ministerial offices. And what happened on the last day of the conference was that presidents and prime ministers took over, and you saw then that climate change actually is a very, very small part of their agenda. And I certainly didn't see that coming, and I'm not sure anyone else did either. The second way in which I think we got it wrong is we didn't see the emergence of the New World Order that came on the last day. You know, we thought in terms of the US and Japan and the EU and the sort of greater mass of developing countries. Well, we started to see it actually during the first week of Copenhagen, but not really its importance, was the kind of split in the developing country bloc. So you had this basic group of countries who actually emerged as a very important bloc right at the end of the meeting, really ripped apart this whole paradigm that we've had of developing world versus developed world, and perhaps has catapulted us into a sort of new climate world of politics where we have what you might call, well, they're calling themselves the progressive countries, and another group of countries that are not quite so progressive. It's a very interesting political agenda because that doesn't work for trade, and it doesn't work for all kinds of other issues, but perhaps it's now the world order that we have to get used to for climate change, and perhaps we should have seen it coming, but I didn't, mea culpa, and I'm not sure that we did overall either.
James, has the failure in Copenhagen changed things at The Guardian, or generally, I think, for environmental journalism? Has it meant that people have suddenly lost interest again? Because there was a whole period, wasn't there, when we were all trying to get it on the agenda, trying to persuade editors there was a story here which we had to do something about, and being knocked back. And then with Copenhagen, they became interested. Richard says the editors picked up on the politicians' wish to do something. We sold them the story, we went to cover it, and then it didn't work. Are we now back in climate fatigue territory?
Perhaps to some extent. I mean, I was certainly between September and the 18th of December, I think it was. I was the busiest, I've ever been in my career, and the build-up to Copenhagen was just absolutely nuts. And certainly there was a huge appetite in the paper at the time. It was also really convenient that I was moving house the day before the last day of Copenhagen. But anyway, actually, I think partly the opinion poll ratings for sort of acceptance of climate change by the general public are linked to the hoax stroke hype, depending on whatever you how you want to characterize it, around Copenhagen, and the fact that the world leaders effectively turned around and said they weren't interested. So I think perhaps a lot of people out there just sort of turn around and say, well, if they're not interested, why should I be interested? I mean, clearly there's still an appetite for stories connected to this, because I mean, there were lots of stories. They may not be the kind of stories that that everyone would have wanted to see happening, but there were lots of stories about climate change in sort of January and February. And as you said earlier on, I think we're sort of back to almost business as usual, where there's more of a mixture of things. So there's certainly less of a focus on climate change, but I think also there's a question around. I know we're going to talk about this later, but about the new sort of political setup and what that sort of means. So I think there's been a kind of wait and see approach. In fact, one very senior UK diplomat, climate negotiator, said to us that it feels a bit like there are small groups of amongst the climate movement wandering in different directions around the battlefield like a beaten army, which I think is an image that sort of chimes. That there are lots, that sort of big coming together you talked about in December has sort of faded away now, and I think everything is still rumbling along beneath the surface, and next time there's a big meeting, it will all come together again.
Is it really a beaten army, Kelly?
No,
or not?
I'd have to disagree with that. I mean, certainly everybody went away and thought, oh, what do we do now? I mean, it was definitely a couple of months of total soul searching. But the GCCA, as I said, I mean, we're 230 organizations and social movements representing labor, environment, development, human rights, the faith community, poverty, I mean, you name it, they're in the GCCA. And we spent about 3 months basically examining what happened at Copenhagen, learning the lessons from it, and redesigning a new strategy.
So what are the lessons? What's the new strategy? What should campaign groups like yours and others now do to put it back on the agenda and get it sorted?
Well, as I said a minute ago, I mean, there was a sense after Copenhagen, okay, they're not going to do it, we have to do it ourselves. Governments aren't going to do it, let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. So the climate movement is looking at a strategy in the next few years which really says, okay, we still need to have that FAB agreement. We still need to make sure it stays in the UNFCCC and that something happens there. But as I said, we need to change this at the national level. People are ready to roll up their sleeves, start taking action. We've got campaigns like 1010. Other organizations are running comparable campaigns where people are just going to roll up their sleeves and get stuff done. And it's our job then to somehow aggregate that and to turn that into a political mandate. But at the same time, we start moving along that pathway to the peak in emissions, which we need to have by 2015. We move in that direction while these guys are still futzing about at the UNFCCC. And I think there's a huge appetite for that. There's a lot of enthusiasm for people to get engaged. We're planning a massive global day of action on October 10th this year, like a get back to work party where people are going to not just stand up and sign a petition or wave a banner or whatever, but actually to take action quite specifically to reduce their own CO2 emissions, to engage in their community, to get people going. We need to make it exciting, and we need to make it cool and fun and interesting, and not just this sort of hopeless, oh, we're just beaten and it's all a failure. I mean, we really need to move off of that narrative. We've put Copenhagen behind us. We've actually put ClimateGate behind us, and we've moved on. So, I think the beaten army might have been in January.
Yeah, that was what I was reading.
Come February, March, we're ready to go again.
But what can you do, though, that will get people like us prepared to put you in our newspapers or on our television screens or on our websites? Because, I don't know about the rest of the journalists here, but there is a sense sometimes amongst editors that campaign groups are doing yet another demonstration, yet another protest, yet another report comes out, and it's a sense of same old, same old. So do you not need to revamp the way you do campaigning in a way that grabs our attention so that we can then put it out to a wider public? And do we as journalists in a moment also have to think again about how we report all these sorts of things?
Yes to the latter. I think you guys should rethink how you report this stuff. I think that, The Guardian is certainly covering the 1010 campaign quite extensively. I think it's an exciting campaign to cover. That's expanding globally. I think that what I think is the news story is the fact that people are prepared to take action. There was another poll in the US that was done in relation to the legislation that's passing through. And it turned out that something like 3 out of every 5 Americans are willing to see climate action, even if it costs them an extra $10 a month in their energy bill. And about 55% are willing to see their energy prices go up by $25 a month. And that's in the middle of a really deep recession. And again, we're talking the US. People are really ready to do something. And I think that the extent to which we can get people to show that, and in particular, what we call the non-usual suspects. If you just have people out, the usual people raising banners, it is a bit ho-hum. But when you see the Boy Scouts, suddenly taking action on climate, or you see, different people that you wouldn't normally expect to do that, that sends a signal, I think, to both politicians and to corporations. And I would hope that that's something that the media would be interested in covering.
Richard, do we have to change our environmental journalism?
I took on to that in a sec, but just one point I wanted to pick up with from Kelly. You mentioned a political mandate, and I think one of the things about climate change and perhaps environmental issues overall is that generally they've not been enough to swing an election. And I'm very interested personally to see what happens in the forthcoming Australian election, because it's entirely possible that a government will get turfed out of office largely because it's not been tough enough on climate change, which would be a real start. And that's something we probably should look to report in some depth if that happens. To change the way we do it, I'm not sure. I think that some media organisations have perhaps been quite campaigning on climate change and have perhaps sort of gone beyond where the science has stopped. as of course of many political figures, and maybe that's something we need to roll back from a little bit collectively and pay a little bit more attention to sort of just what has been demonstrated in the science and what hasn't been. Right, it's not a terribly exciting answer.
James, do you want to add something?
In terms of how to report, I think it's important to be more multi-dimensional, I think, than perhaps we have previously. So there's only so many times that I think people want to read it's worse than the scientists thought. So those kind of stories, although the more science that comes along is obviously going to be important, that on its own is not going to convince people that they have to make major sacrifices in their lives or something like that. The story needs to be reported from all sorts of angles. Campaigns like 1010, I think, are superb and give one different way into it, but also things like on the mitigation side, the adaptation side. On mitigation, some of the new technology that's around that is going to help us get out of the mess always does really well on the website. New kind of low carbon technologies that look like they might be a game changer always excite people. But I think from a sort of campaign point of view, whether this sort of translates into lots of stories in newspapers, I'm not quite sure. But from a campaigner's point of view and from the sort of political argument point of view, I think climate change has been a huge failure. Climate change argument has been a huge failure of people on the right of the political spectrum. They have failed to engage with it because they are, and perhaps part of the reason for that is because it has been so embraced by people on the left of the political spectrum. So the people on the right feel that it is this kind of watermelon issue that is green on the outside and red on the inside, and they see it as a kind of Trojan horse for delivering lots of money from the developed countries to the developing countries. And there are obviously lots of good reasons for making the world a more equal place and solving those inequalities, but I haven't quite finished formulating my thoughts on this, but I'm coming to the view that putting development and environment and climate change specifically together doesn't always serve climate change, because I think it turns off a huge part of the audience. And so the argument needs to be remade by those people on the right and for those people on the right in terms of things like jobs, energy security, green technology, although that's a horrible phrase, and kind of we should be competing with China because they'll overtake us type arguments. And maybe the new government will start to make arguments in that sort of frame.
Is there a need perhaps to do more along the lines of, for example, the campaign that's been running about tar sands and investments by BP and Shell? We've had the Shell AGM today. 11% of people at that AGM either abstained or voted for a motion asking for Shell to think more carefully about investment in tar sands. BP, it was 15% at their AGM. People in the campaigning movement, and perhaps we as journalists as well, to look more closely at these business, financial, economic issues around climate change, rather than the traditional, more eco issues, if you like, that we've looked at, or the policy issues, the big global warming picture. Should we start focusing in, and that addresses your point about the right as well, on the money?
Absolutely, and that's happening all over the place. And it's interesting, I just came across something on the web the other day. It was a speech given by somebody, I didn't even say what the forum was, but it was a speech written by somebody, and it was presented by somebody from the perspective of the mining community. And it was all about sustainability, and it was talking about climate change as being the defining issue of our times, and we need to get with the program. We need to, it was kind of a shock to me to see that, even the mining industry in some quarters are talking about this issue. And I think that it, and to your point about appealing to the right in some way, there's a group of retired generals in the US that are talking about the issue, not in terms of just energy security, but security more generally. And it's a whole question of how we perceive risk. And it puzzles me that somehow this issue has not been accepted on the right to some extent, because it is such an issue of security, and I would have thought it would appeal to them. And I think we really need to make more effort to reach out to people who aren't like us and make them understand that this is actually in their best interest as well.
Sorry, Richard.
No,
I was going to say, James mentioned the new government. We have a conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, which, if you look at the agreement that they published, superficially at least, looks pretty good from a Green perspective, I suspect. Certainly, it could have been worse. So, do we need to think, or what do we need to do to think about how we hold them to account, how we report the new government and test it against its own manifesto and its own agreements? Richard?
I'm not sure there's a really huge story there, to be honest with you, because I think it's not that different from what Labour was doing anyway. The kind of European energy context and climate targets and so on has been pretty much set for a couple of years now, and also with the recession, it kind of almost makes it mandatory that the UK and a lot of other European countries will sort of meet immediate short-term targets. Where Britain goes with its energy supply is an interesting issue, and is the carbon price high enough to drive low carbon investment and things like this? But I don't think it's as stories about the carbon price don't do hugely well on our website. That's for sure.
Oh, I can never get them on the telly.
No, surprising that, isn't it? They're often having to traders on for other stories, but not so much for environment. I just want to come back on this issue of different groups putting different messages across, because I probably got a slightly different handle on this. I mean, from my point of view, the investment thing has certainly been happening for 7-8 years. I mean, there are groups of responsible shareholders, as they call themselves, trying to get big corporations to do something. I'm just not sure that kind of scattergun approach in the end brings the kind of electoral change which ultimately is probably necessary to drive mass policy across much of the Western world. And I'm not sure also that the sort of consumer action or sort of personal action is really enough, again, to drive that change. If you look at the uptake, for example, of the people that buy sustainable timber or sustainable fish or whatever you call it, small proportions of the population. And also, there is a powerful argument that this whole narrative takes the responsibility away from governments. They say, fine, if you do it, you take individual action, we'll encourage you, we'll help you, we'll set up websites showing you how you can lower your carbon footprint. Takes responsibility away from governments. I'm not really sure, therefore, that it's a sort of strategy that ultimately is going to lead to the kind of wholesale changes, the wholesale decarbonisation that, in the end, is what countries are going to have to do if you are to make the kind of trajectories that the IPCC and others set out.
I agree with you to the extent that the big decisions about energy infrastructure, do we go for nuclear, how many coal-fired power stations do we allow to be built, et cetera, are not the sort of thing that consumers can have much of an impact on. But I do disagree, actually, that individual actions are not important, because I think the 10-10 campaign is the example, the sort of counter-example, because Lizzie will perhaps correct me if I get the figures wrong, but I think there are something like 60,000 people who've signed up to it now, and something like 10,000 businesses, or...
So that's 0.1% of the British population then.
Sure. But I mean, you would have seen in that coalition document that the government has now signed up to 10-10. Central government estate has signed up to cutting its carbon emissions by 10% in the next 12 months. That wouldn't have happened without...
Its carbon emissions.
Pardon?
Its carbon emissions,
it's
not society's carbon emissions.
No, not our carbon, not everyone's. No,
Well,
I agree.
Let's throw this open to the audience anyway. Let's give Lizzie a microphone there and get her to explain this to us.
Hello, everybody. I'm Lizzie from 1010 Global. I just wanted to clarify a small point, because 1010 is about asking not just individuals, but businesses, organisations, all of society, and countries and governments to cut 10%. So the great thing we think about our campaign is that your actions aren't just a drop in the ocean. So normally you think, well, why should I cut my flights when my next door neighbour's taking loads or the government's not doing anything? And our hope is that by pulling all these actions under one umbrella, it becomes a political mandate. And that's what we saw with the government announcement last week. And now we have 10-10 campaigns in quite a few countries now. So we're going to be using that UK government to pressure the other governments to also make commitments. Of course, it's not enough. Of course, our campaign isn't going to save the world on its own. But we think it has a real strength in bringing people together. And when you hear that, in fact, today we had the biggest surprise since the government made the announcement, when one of our campaigners' mothers got sent a letter from the Royal Mail, and the franking was 10-10. So the Royal Mail, who've signed up to do 10-10, they are cutting 10% of their emissions, and they've made a special 10-10 franking. So when you get your letter, you're being reminded of cutting your own carbon emissions. And so when you see Tottenham Hotspurs have changed their lights, the National Gallery have changed to LED lighting, first art gallery in the world, I believe. Microsoft have made changes, along with like your supermarket and your church and your green group. We really hope that this will inspire people and also show politicians that there is appetite, and that while, okay, Copenhagen was a failure, if you look at motivations and you look at surveys of motivations, most people agree with the comment that we're all responsible. We should all do something. So while they might not know about the science, and in fact our campaign stays well away from the science because it's quite boring sometimes, sorry. But you know, like energy bills and all of that stuff is actually a little bit boring. So we really focus on the motivation and creating this positive narrative going forward. Just wanted to correct that there.
Okay, no worries. Let's open to other people. Who else wants to contribute? Over here, gentleman here.
Can I ask your view, considering the debacle that Copenhagen became, largely because of the willingness of all the major players, and indeed some of the less major players as well, to play real political hardball, is there actually, from your views, any real purpose in trying still to arrive at a multilateral treaty? The very strong impression that one got post-Copenhagen was that the future is going to be a series of bilateral treaties globally. And what I'm really curious about is, what advice would you give to campaign groups that focus so much attention on Copenhagen, that invested the UNFCCC with such importance, only to see it all collapse in flames around them? Should they still be really putting great hopes on that particular organisation, or should there be a more realistic appraisal of what the future would seem to be?
All right, let's take another couple of questions and then we can address them. There's a gentleman there.
Hi, first, Kelly, I stand in awe of your optimism, but my question is for our journalists. Where was the investigative journalism of the guys that broke into the University of East Anglia? I didn't see it. I didn't see anyone getting chased down. It was clearly not some random person who was just curious. That was part of an orchestrated large campaign to discredit things, right? And nothing. Maybe I missed it.
And Bob here, yeah.
I just wanted to say, I think you've been incredibly gentle on the research community tonight. I think it's apparent that both with the IPCC and the emails, that this has become much more of a problem simply by the way the research community has reacted. But my question is, what do you think it will take to change attitudes amongst your editors? Because to me, that has been the biggest problem here. I think the public have been less swayed by this than editors in newsrooms. Have you seen signs that they've become better informed or more in favour of lunatic conspiracy theories about climate change as a result of this?
Okay, thank you. Well, let's start with you, Kelly. I mean, from the question over there, should we be thinking again, or should you as campaign groups be thinking again about a single global treaty and perhaps, maybe going back to square one and campaigning for something different?
Well, first off, the UNFCCC is the only body in which all countries have a stake and a voice, et cetera. As soon as you move on to bilateral agreements, you're probably leaving out the most vulnerable countries, which have the most to lose by the failure. So I think it would be unfortunate to move away from that. Secondly, I think that in order to solve climate change, we need to change the whole way investments are done, and that's only going to happen really to the extent that we are going to get a peak in global emissions by around 2015, which is what we need. You're going to need to do that by having an agreement that's international, that everyone's playing by the same rules, or it's just not going to happen. So I think that there's no choice but to keep working on that. But as I said before, I think that what needs to change is that there's no point in campaigning on the meetings themselves. You need to campaign to change the political will, because that will have an impact in the negotiations themselves, and that's where we need to do things a bit differently.
Let's.
Yeah, perhaps to deal with your
I was going to say the
point.
investigative question is certainly one I think. I personally share it. I think.
I completely agree. Certainly, from the BBC's point of view, we have tried. I mean, it was one of the first questions that we asked, and so the first thing we did was look at the documents that we had available, talk to computer security experts, say, is it possible to trace this back? And the answer that we got, and I know your colleagues of yours at The Guardian tried the same thing, we just didn't get anywhere. We've talked to freelance journalists in Russia, because Russia was fingered as a possible source very early, didn't get anywhere. So we failed, and I agree, it would be a fantastic story to write.
We were talking about science.
Can you just take the microphone there?
Science earlier.
Sure.
I mean, I think it was lamentable that it never crossed anyone's mind at East Anglia that they might be a target and they might want to get some very serious security on their machines. It was just on an old server that they had backed it up to, which was, I mean, no normal corporation would do that. Maybe, parts of the British government do it all the time.
I mean, we looked at Channel 4 News as well, and just like Richard did, and I'm sure The Guardian did as well. We spent hours with computer security experts and trying to chase things up, and we just hit brick walls, dead ends all the time. And unusually on situations like this as well, where as journalists, the police are often very helpful.
Yeah.
The police inquiry has been a stone wall. I mean, the Norfolk Constabulary and the Met, who are involved a little bit as well from the computer crimes lot, have blanked. Right. So we've, what might be our normal sources haven't been available to us.
Which tells you how well organised it was and what a high level it was.
I actually happened to meet one of the scientists who used to work at UEA, who hasn't worked there for a few years, who was involved in the setting up of the security system. And he said in retrospect he wasn't entirely surprised that this happened, because as scientists, this is partly what I was going back to earlier on about the scientists in this area assuming they could just do science and that would be enough. And obviously in the case of UEA, there are institutions assuming they could just do science and that would be okay. It speaks to Bob's point. I think the research community clearly was completely unprepared for all facets of this, including hacking attempts, and they'll probably have to change their ways. There's any doubt about that. Can I just come back to the point over here, Julian? Sorry, I don't want to hold the discussion, but my sort of overwhelming, I suppose, interpretation of Copenhagen was that for many countries, the big developing countries in particular, there's a kind of economic trade-off here. Either you restrain emissions now, in which case that has a certain impact on your economic growth, or you let economic growth go on with emissions, and then perhaps you do something about it in the long term. Now, the Stern Review suggested that it's actually much better economically to restrain your emissions now. To my mind, what Copenhagen showed us was that a number of other important countries have come to the opposite conclusion. I mean, someone said to me, who's been involved with the Chinese government, China's always been a 550 ppm country. That's the economic analysis that they've done at the highest level. This was the interpretation. And I'm sure that a number of other large developing countries. So when you're talking about campaigning, what do campaigners do? As campaigners, I'm sure you have to try every sort of thing that you can think of. But to me, that's the paradigm that you're faced with. Some important countries have decided it's actually not in their interests to cut emissions now.
On Bob's point about editors, do you have to change your editor's attitude as a result of all of this or not?
No, because as I alluded to earlier on, we're in quite a kind of fortunate situation. Just to come back, just a brief point on what you were saying about China. I mean, it was evident from testimony from in the room that China not only blocked the idea of a deal amongst all the countries, but it also blocked a deal amongst just the rich countries, presumably because it was thinking to itself, in a few years' time, we're going to be part of that club and we don't want to constrain our economic growth. So that is part of this change in the paradigm. In terms of the investigative journalism point, I mean, part 5 of the 5-part series that we did was about who did the hack. And I would concur with what's been said, that we got reasonably far in that we closed off a number of options that were out there and said, no, that's probably not the case. All these kind of wild theories about the Russian government, Russian secret intelligence service being involved were just wrong. And actually, I think the truth is probably much more mundane, and is probably the case of someone just snooping around a bit and effectively finding the information there, because there is a precedent for that. Steve McIntyre, the blogger who runs a blog site called Climate Audit, who was one of the people who was bombarding the scientists with Freedom of Information Act requests, he had done that previously. He found information on a UEA server and published it. So on that occasion, he sort of admitted that was what had happened, and maybe something similar has happened, but either him or someone else. I'm not accusing him without any evidence, obviously, but maybe something like that happened. On Bob's point about us being a bit soft on the research community, I'd kind of neglected to go into the sort of post-mortem side of things. But I mean, the committee of MPs that looked into the climate emails criticised what they called a culture of withholding information, something that the chair of the committee, Phil Willis, called reprehensible. And there was certainly, I think, a culture. I mean, the committee didn't blame the scientists so much, because they said, we think that the university should have given them much more support. And the scientists just hadn't reacted to the new world that they were living in, where they were being bombarded. The Freedom of Information Act that was the main difficulty for them. They were being bombarded with these requests, and they perceived them as coming from people who were hostile to them. And so their natural reaction was to sort of circle the wagons and say, we're not going to release this information. And we can have an argument about exactly which cases they did or didn't release information, but that was clearly, if you read a lot of the emails, that was clearly the sort of the thread that runs through it.
Some more questions. Kelly, you want to come back?
Yeah, I just want to make one comment on this China thing, because I think particularly in the UK, media covered it. They really did a big China blame game after Copenhagen, and I just don't want to leave that sitting here, because obviously there were quite a few other countries that were to blame for the failure in Copenhagen, including the United States, including Europe, and who didn't do what they needed to do. And I just want to also mention that the fact that this blame game on China played out so strongly actually damaged the good guys in China, because there's a skeptics movement there as well. And as soon as this whole thing played out of where they got the blame for it, it just completely strengthened their hand, and has made people who are more progressive within the government have just been kind of back-footed and driven a bit further back into a corner. So anyway, I just wanted to make sure that got onto the record.
There was a conversation in Copenhagen, I can't remember if you were there or not, Richard, immediately after the event, which the blame was very firmly put on China in a briefing situation, which I think might have sparked a lot of that.
Yeah. But I think, that having been said, you wouldn't query the fact, would you, that China on the one hand and Saudi Arabia and so on, was sitting in the group of G77, the developing countries, including the highly vulnerable countries, the ones that actually are going for 1.5 Celsius or even 1 Celsius, that China was supposedly in the same block, and yet actually was not fighting for anything like that level.
Let's not get too heavily into the detail of what happened. Very briefly, Kelly, and then some more questions.
No, I mean, I agree that it was a failure on the part of the major emitters all the way around. There was not enough ambition in the room, but it needs to be apportioned fairly.
Well, another question there.
I have a question about subtle dynamics that often are difficult to capture in big newspapers. And this subtle dynamic relates to Latin America. If you look around, a lot of the narratives in both in newspapers and campaigns, you get a lot of attention when it comes to the basic countries, the large economies, especially India and China. Or you get stories about very poor people in Africa or islands. But then you look at countries like Colombia, look at countries like Mexico, you look at countries like mine, Costa Rica. You just elected a woman, and now it's going to be a female chief in the UNFCCC. You also look at countries like Chile, who are doing a lot of things. And there is what I call the silent majority, that is middle-income economies that are not big enough to get attention from clean tech investors, but they are not poor enough to get attention from DFID or developmental NGOs quite understandably good reasons, tend to focus on the most vulnerable countries. But if you look at the political dynamics right now, these groups are in the middle, are very important because they are tired of the bigger, larger developing countries. They know they can't really do alliances with China, but they really want to get out of the victimhood narratives. So they want to go away from asking for aid, and they want investment, they want help, and they are willing to be ambitious. And I know that these news don't sell newspapers, but I do think that journalists, especially in the UK, have a tendency to cover climate change from an either China-India perspective or Africa perspective, and you barely capture very positive stories from Latin America. So I just would like some comments on that.
Okay, the lady at the front here, and then this gentleman at the back.
I have a question about a very important event starting tomorrow, and I want to know how you're going to cover it, or if you are. As you know, in Aberdeen, the big all-energy conference this year, focusing on renewables, is going to start. And I find these I'm not going to Aberdeen for various reasons. I'm a journalist in this. But I want to know if Channel 4, the BBC, and The Guardian are going to have people in place. I also want to mention, this lady just mentioned lesser developed countries. In Abu Dhabi, they have this big thing, Masdar. Masdar advertising like mad on CNN. And I believe, and say what you will about Abu Dhabi and lack of freedom, Abu Dhabi's advertising is holding up a brilliant, positive fantasy of a world of renewable energy, of energy efficiency. Probably very few of you here watch CNN, but you should really see the adverts, because this is what I think we need, something positive. You're not running your newspapers for propaganda, but I know it. You know what I mean.
Okay. And the gentleman in the shirt and the glasses at the back.
Hi there. My name is Benjamin Ward. I'm from WWF. I just wanted to make a quick point and then pose a question. I was just interested, Kelly, to hear you sort of say, I think you said two things. One, that the public doesn't understand uncertainty in science, which I think probably you didn't mean it that generally. But I wondered whether that was the right approach for campaigning. And also, doesn't that uncertainty actually help us make an argument about risk, that we actually do need to take action regardless of some of the uncertainties of where the impacts are? I think uncertainties were perhaps at the heart of some of the stories we were central to earlier this year. But my question really was, do we, all the journalists on the panel, you come from organisations who've generally been very, very supportive and very balanced, but we know that there are sectors of the media out there that aren't. Do you think as campaigners we need to worry about reaching them, or do we just leave them get on with it? And actually, as campaign groups, do we need to be so visible at all in the media, or do we need to be helping other interests to be out there talking about climate change and widening the debate?
Okay, let's start with Latin America. I mean, are we, as journalists, guilty of stereotyping and guilty of presenting the story, if you like, as a black and white battle between rich and poor, and there's a whole raft of stories in the middle that we've missed out on?
I think there's some truth in that characterization, yes. And I mean, prior to Copenhagen, we did try to flesh out things a bit by having some sort of more background about some of the countries that you don't always hear about, and also from Copenhagen we ran stories from journalists there from a variety of different countries, including some from South America. But I take that criticism on the chin. I think we probably haven't done enough.
BBC too?
I think the BBC, well, I think the British media in general, historically, has been very poor at covering Latin America. And that's basically because it hasn't had any colonies there. If you look at, Africa, South Asia, that's where the colonies were. That's where we report. I'm sure it struck me the first few times I spoke, for example, to US conservation groups. They were all active in Latin America. The UK conservation groups generally more active in South Asia, Africa. It's just the way the world's divided up. But I agree with James. I think the sort of middle income stuff has not been particularly easy for us to do. Just turning on to a couple of other things. I think your point about Mazda is very interesting. I've been struck for quite a long time how to me, the sort of renewables industry here doesn't make a big enough play of how cool some of it is. I mean, I remember several years ago going to visit a chap who had, solar panels on his roof. He's a sort of investment banker, and he just did it because it was cool. Isn't it great to have these on your roof and generate your own electricity and see this little dial going around? And I thought, yeah, absolutely, it is quite cool actually. I like technical things, I like making things, and yeah, it's brilliant. So maybe you're right. Maybe there is a lesson. We won't be in Aberdeen, as far as I know. It's possible the Scottish Bureau will be there, but yeah. Actually, I'll shut up for the moment while I think about what I wanted to say to the chap at the back.
All right. Let me just add on Latin America. I mean, at Channel 4 News, we didn't go to the smaller countries. We went to Brazil, but within Brazil, ahead of Copenhagen, with a week of live broadcasting from Brazil ahead of Copenhagen, we did use Brazil, if you like, to illustrate some of the differences between rich, poor, the discovery of the oil offshore and what that means for the country. I personally went right up into the northeast, into the very, very dry areas where there are real problems. We were reporting from Sao Paulo, from Rio. So I think, to a degree, we touched upon some of the issues that you talked about, but certainly not in the extent to which we perhaps could have done and should have done. And I think, too, we probably need to take that one on the chin as well. James, what about, well, first of all, will you be at the All Energy Conference?
I'm going to inquire with my energy colleagues first thing tomorrow and find out whether they're on top of it.
But on Richard's point, which I think is more about the Mazar thing, is that does the guy? I mean, you've now got a green technology correspondent in Alok. Do you view these things as cool and as something that you should be giving more coverage to?
Yeah, I mean, having one person who's specifically looking at that beat was, a kind of strategic decision to make sure that those things had more of a life in the paper and on the website. And as I was saying earlier on, those kind of stories do really, really well for us. And in fact, we're doing, when I left today, it was still on page 3. It may not be there by the morning, but the UK's first solar energy farm down it, which is got planning permission going through next week in Cornwall, is a big story that we're doing tomorrow. So yeah, I mean, sort of gadget stories we like, and we definitely think it's cool. I wonder if I quickly respond to the chap at the back. I think you should absolutely engage with other media, because they're those the Sun, the Mail, dare I say the Express, if you can. Because I mean, if you ignore those people, they're from the point of view of changing minds and changing governments and changing policies. I mean, you have to get to those people. So, and they're not bad people just because they read the Express. So,
I won't ask you, Kelly, to comment on the new UK newspaper industry, because I know you don't normally live here. But from a campaigner's perspective, should campaigners be talking to the tabloid newspapers, the right-wing newspapers, the newspapers that, by and large, don't normally, or the TV stations as well? Fox News. I mean, should you be trying to engage with Fox News?
Absolutely. Totally agree with that. I mean, I was looking the other day, just for example, in the U.S., at what the largest circulation magazines are, and the largest one is the magazine of the American Association for Retired People, AARP. The acronym is, I mean, it's some surprising one, but I mean, there's like, Garden and Gun, which is about, magazine about Southern living in the U.S. I mean, yeah, if you want to get your message out to different audiences, you should be sending your press release to Garden and Gun, Why not?
Well, I mean, I get the magazine of the British sort of Hunting Association every month, and I rarely read it all, but these guys view themselves as pro-conservation. You have to have something to shoot, right, if you're going to go and shoot. So you have to conserve that thing to go and shoot. So if climate change wipes out whatever they hunt in the south of the States, I don't know what it is, but maybe there's an angle there for you.
Okay, more questions. Lady at the front here.
I have a question about technology. I'm rather unimpressed by most people's arguments that there are new technologies coming on stream, this magical, mystical future, and there isn't enough discussion about how we're going to deploy the technologies we already have. So, and at the moment, I'm not seeing that in any of this media, and I want to know if people are going to start having stories about let's use what we've got, and who's doing that, and China is doing that, very much so.
So who else have we got? Somebody over here, and then a lady there.
Hi, I'm from an energy efficiency company, and we are bringing a product to the marketplace that helps companies to reduce their carbon emissions. And for me personally, coming from a sustainability background, some of the things that have been raised this evening really resonate. For example, the fact of the matter is that in the media, the issue about sustainability is portrayed in this sort of Disney-style fight against climate change. Obviously it's very true the climate is going to change with our increased emissions. But the fact of the matter is that it's almost a bit simplistic, and it's very easy for it to be a crusade. Now, it's almost like, do you think, and I know this has been raised already, but do you think it's time to move away from the climate change aspect, which of course is very important, but often not necessarily important to people and their own lives, and more about the financial, the economic side of things? Because of course, Western nations, we're hemorrhaging value in terms of our wasted energy, and we don't have our own energy resources anymore. So do you think, what do we need to do to change the tack in the media?
Okay, and there was somebody there who wanted to ask a question. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's it.
Hello, I'm Adila. I'm from Friends of the Earth. I wanted to ask a question. Really, environmentalists are often accused of being doom mongers, really. We're all going to die tomorrow. There's no time to make a difference. And I think many environmental organisations are trying to reposition themselves around an agenda of hope, inspiration and ambition. And one of the battles I have very often with talking to campaigners about media stories is that it's much harder to sell good news stories to the media. We're trying to, in the light of the general election and the new politics, there's an opportunity to really engage, particularly with the economic debate about creating jobs, a low carbon economy, energy security, tackling poverty, fuel poverty. But packaging those stories up and working with journalists to get those positive stories out is quite challenging. And so I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I mean, you're right initially, because the journalists look for, I suppose, one of the great truisms, isn't it? We look for conflict. We look for one side versus the other side, and sometimes the good news stories don't fit that paradigm, and so it becomes difficult for us. But I mean, Richard, Adila's point about changing the paradigm, going from the end of the world is nigh to one of hope, does that become more difficult to report?
Well, as a BBC journalist, of course, I'm not allowed to say what's good news and what's bad
well,
news.
You see on one hand, it's gone off our state. You're all right now.
Okay, fine. Yeah. We should be downstairs then, shouldn't we? I personally, I'm quite happy with good news stories, to be honest. I mean, I've written a story this afternoon about the biggest commercial forestry protection agreement in the world, unveiled in Canada. Some of your friends over at Pew played a leading role in that. We're doing the first national shark sanctuary in the world. I mean, this is kind of interesting stuff, and I suspect people do actually quite like it. I think as journalists, we're perhaps sort of overly cynical. I don't know what that means to you, whether you have to appeal to journalists' better nature or something. Better luck, best of luck with that one. But I just wanted to come back on the other things about energy and energy efficiency and so on. I think that the root thing to me is that you can have all the cool technologies in the world and all the great energy-saving gadgets in the world, but unless the economic levers are right, they're not going to get rolled out. And this is something that I feel is often lacking from our coverage of this area. Someone's come up with a discovery that you can make oil out of algae or something, and it'll have a negative carbon footprint. Yeah, but how much does it cost? And where are the economic levers to bring that actually into mass production? That's a very boring part of the story. I'm sure it would be do terribly
No,
on,
no, it's
on
they're
telly,
very hard to
but
do on
it's
telly
actually
sometimes.
the crucial thing. Yeah.
Kelly, do you share Adila's view that this realignment is necessary, that to perhaps switch from the end of the world is nigh to an agenda of hope? And does that, for a campaigner, do you have the same difficulties?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, you can boil it all down to a sort of strategic messaging thing. And I don't want to give the impression that this notion of hope is just that, as some sort of a calculated message thing. I think that, you know, the point is we are in a dire situation. Everybody realizes we're in a dire situation, but we need to motivate people to take action. And it turns out, you know, a lot of studies have shown that people filter news, and they filter, you know, their experience based on what they already believe, and that belief is based on what they already do in their lives, what job they hold, what they're prepared to do, et cetera. So if you can start to, which is one of the reasons why the idea of working on behavior change campaigns is good. If you start by getting people to change their behavior, you realize that there's a positive element to it. They can save money. They can, you know, there's some good things about it. Actually, they realize it's not so hard, and all of this notion of cutting emissions is not really, you know, suddenly changing your whole way of life. You can, you know, whatever. Then your opinions start to evolve a bit as well, and that eventually can translate into a change in political belief. And so I think that, you know, I actually am hopeful. I mean, I have to be hopeful in a sense because I have 2 children, and you know, I refuse to not be hopeful because otherwise the alternative is just giving up. So for me, I mean, so I've fallen into that same category of filtering things, I guess, based on my own values. But you know, I think for a lot of people in the movement, they do share that genuine hope that it's worthwhile, what they're doing. And I think that it's the question of how you translate that into something that is newsworthy. We really do need to turn the corner on climategate and Copenhagen and all of that, and start getting climate back onto the front pages in a completely different kind of narrative than we've had in the past. Because what we've got in the past, and you know, to comment on that bit about uncertainty, you know, I think that the question of whether Michael Mann's hockey stick has a mistake in it or not is not something the public is equipped to judge. You know, that needs to happen on the pages of the journals. And there's no point in having those kinds of debates amongst the public because the public isn't qualified to judge that. And I think the public does have an understanding of sort of a precautionary approach, a risk approach to a certain extent, but a lot of people don't. They hear uncertainty, they think, don't bother. So we just move away from that whole thing and actually just focus on opportunities we have to change things now, what's in your own power to do to change your own life, and how can we then, as the environmental movement, as the climate movement, how can you then translate that into something that makes sense to politicians where they realize they have a mandate to do the right thing from the public? Because to be honest, that's really what they're looking for is votes in the next election. And so they need to be able to realize that, Richard mentioned the Australian case, that if you don't do something, this is going to translate into an election loss.
James, do you want to add anything before we finish?
Yes, just for you, I mean, just to slightly look at from the other direction at what the lady from the Friends of the Earth said. I mean, I'm almost surprised that the doom-laden message is so easy to sell. I mean, you know, I think now it's hard to get the kind of it's worse than we thought stories into the paper than it was, you know, 5 or 10 years ago. So actually, the sort of stories about, wow, gee whiz, there's a farmer in Cornwall generating energy from a solar farm, you know, in rain-drenched Cornwall. How is that possible? But that sort of story, you know, I think is an easier sell actually. I don't think just to briefly pick up on your question. I think you're absolutely right that there are lots of technologies around today, or lots of things that we should be doing that we collectively as a society are not doing, and you know, mostly around energy efficiency and insulating lofts and all of that kind of stuff. The reason that doesn't get very much coverage is that it tends to be, you know, they're fairly mundane technologies that are basically out there already, and so it's hard to make them into news. But the fact that the government is, you know, the previous government and this one have specific kind of incentive mechanisms that turn it into a sort of consumer story. You can go out and get X thousand pounds to put you know, to help lag your loft or whatever it is important. But we're in the business of news, not in the business of campaigning. So you know, just because they're a good thing to do, you're shaking your head, but just because they're a good thing to do doesn't mean say that it necessarily makes it easy for us to write
I think
about
it plays a little bit to Kelly's point, doesn't it, about where you place your story. Because, you know, as James says, we're in the business of news, but that sort of stuff perhaps is better in gun and gun.
Exactly.
Maybe.
Garden and gun.
Richard, do you want to read anything? Do you want to read as we end?
I suppose I just sort of, having lived through the hellhole of Copenhagen, I just thought one final observation, I suppose, on that is that it struck me that since Rio, and I'm probably as guilty of this as anyone, we've kind of viewed climate change as something sort of separate. We have this international agreement. It's supposed to give money from the rich to the poor who are harmed by something that the rich has done in the past, and there's a whole framework that's sort of established to set that up. And in hindsight, I'm kind of wondering, why did we think that would work when it clearly doesn't work in so many other areas of international relations? You know, in every other area of international relations, the strong say what they're going to do and the weak live with it. And it seems to me that that's kind of where we're at on climate internationally, really. But final thought.
It's an interesting thought. Thank you all very much indeed for coming this evening. It's been a fascinating. Can I thank our three panellists here today, Kelly Rigg, Richard Black, and James Randerson. Thank you.